I'm really, really pleased to introduce a very dear friend, Neal Lane, who is currently the Malcolm Gillis University professor at Rice University, and he has appointments in the Baker Institute for Public Policy. And he's a genuine physicist, but more importantly, he's a very dear friend who served as I first met him when he was president of Sigma Xi, and then I followed him. I seem to be following you everywhere, Neal. And he became the director of the National Science Foundation, and was instrumental, I think, in my being selected as the director of NSF to follow Neal. But he went on to become the science advisor in the Office of Technology and Policy in the Clinton administration. A mentor and a friend, someone who really gives good advice. And I was very serious when I said, like my husband Jack, he's the sort of guy that if you're going to be a scientist, find someone like him to marry. So with that, Neal, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. That's so nice. I'll tell my wife what you said. Be very pleased. I want to start by congratulating the Rosalind Franklin Society for all that the society does to remind the world of the extraordinary contributions of women in science, and offer my congratulations as well to Joe and to the Vilceks and their foundation for all that they've done to recognize contributions of immigrants in many fields. We of course all admire the pioneers in all areas, and so Rosalind Franklin was certainly one in the area of science, and that's why we have this society. People who worked under extraordinarily difficult circumstances and often did not get the credit that they deserved. And so we're the beneficiaries of their contributions. But then many who followed them, I mean, they were those people like Rosalind Franklin were models, and I think then that led to many, many women who still, it's clear, are overcoming obstacles, and we're indebted to all of them as well. We all benefit from those contributions. Now, when I looked at the website, I noticed that one of my former friend and former co-worker, Millie Dresselhaus, gave a talk here maybe last year. So knowing that Millie is thoughtful and candid, I thought I'd find out what she said. So I called Millie, and Millie said, said her experience starting in the 60s was much different from that of Rosalind Franklin, that she had been fortunate to be at a place that believed in the meritocracy, that what matters is the work you do, contributions you make, and that Rosalind Franklin did not work in that atmosphere. Well, I worked with Millie before. I mean, Millie may be the kind of superwoman that we just heard about. She's an extraordinary intellect and force in all the kinds of interactions that we've had together. Today, it's clear that there are many institutions that perhaps on the surface do believe in meritocracy and exhibit it in many of the things they do, but there are problems. And we just heard about some of them from this wonderful talk from Eileen. Last week, we lost a great leader in science, engineering, and education, one of MIT's former presidents, Chuck Vest, recently president of the National Academy of Engineering. Just a huge loss, I think, for all of us. And I know this preface that he wrote is famous. Now, it was in the New York Times obituary and lots of other places. Maybe it's been quoted here already. In connection with the MIT study, he wrote in the preface, "I've always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within universities is part reality and part perception, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance." As you know, Nancy Hopkins headed up that, I think, 4-year study that led to groundbreaking changes, I think, at MIT by Chuck and also by Bergeneau, who I think at that time was provost. And the recent Yale study of gender bias, Jo Handelsman and her colleagues wrote the article, carried out the study and wrote the article, and Eileen talked about it a little bit ago. makes very clear there's little question but what there's discrimination, and one can talk about what the reasons for it are, but pretty clear it's there. And some of it may be quite subtle. So organizations like this one are all the more important in my view. And I applaud all of you for making a difference, not just with the organization, but everything you do every day. I note that on your board, Jennifer West, a former Rice faculty member now at Duke, member of your board, Bill Brinkley, who we work with at Baylor, and Huda Zogby, who's worked with us on some American Academy activities, and I also have the good pleasure to work with in Houston. So you have a great board and quite an extraordinary body of women and men. I was encouraged to say a little bit about my own background. I'm basically a kid from Oklahoma. I had the good fortune to have wonderful parents, poor as church mice, but very fine people. Married my high school sweetheart, 53 years now. That's worked out extremely well. I had several excellent teachers, but some really bad ones. Had some good mentors. Got a faculty job at a great place, worked with outstanding students, wrote some papers, got some grants, had a chance to dabble in administration and policy, all of which I've enjoyed. I was really privileged to work in the Clinton administration, National Science Foundation for 5 years and White House OSTP for 2.5 years. And I think you know that when you're doing any of those kind of jobs, running or thinking you're trying to run an organization or advising a president or anybody else for that matter, you need a lot of help. Sometimes just good advice, but other times you need people to get you out of trouble. And in my case, I needed both. And many, as you'll hear in a minute, many of the people who helped get me out of trouble were women. And most of those were women scientists. So I thought the best way maybe for you to give some indication of where I am, where my mind is on this issue, is just to give you some examples. So these are the experiences. So they should do two things. They should show you why women in my policy life, at least, are so incredibly important to me, quite aside from the abstract, but on specifics, why they're so important to me. But also it'll raise a few of the kind of issues that you tend to run into when you're involved in federal policy domain. So, of course, high on the list is Rita Caldwell, who, as you all know, welcomes challenges, no matter how big, how small, forges ahead with intellect and courage. And she and I could tell you war stories of our work together, but we'll let that pass by, for the moment anyway. My list is really long. Mary Good. She was then Undersecretary of Technology at the Department of Commerce. She got NSF and me personally out of a huge jam when an influential member of Congress, in this case a very high-ranking Democrat, pressured us to cancel the purchase of a supercomputer that was being sold by a Japanese company. No law against that, no Buy American law, but this particular member of Congress did not like it, and I was going to do something about it or else. If you're interested later, I'll tell you how we resolved it, but I just happened to mention it to Mary Good at lunch one day. She picked it up. She said, you know, it's the kind of issue the Commerce Department can deal with. We look at dumping issues, so forth. She resolved it so that we did not violate any laws. We did not get sued. However, we didn't buy the Japanese supercomputer. Anita Jones. She was, at that time, a Director of Defense Research and Engineering in the Pentagon. She, again, this wasn't her issue particular to worry about, but she heard from us that we were having some problems with the Antarctic program. The Navy had been flying the heavy lift aircraft to get us from New Zealand to McMurdo and then on to the South Pole, and the Navy decided to stop. They're just not going to fly those planes anymore. So Anita pulled together some generals and admirals, and I don't know what she told them, but anyway, the Air Force took it over, and the Air National Guard, I think, still does that today. Marcy Greenwood, she was Associate Director for Science in the White House. Marcy's gone on to do great things, happily living in Hawaii now, I think, running University of Hawaii. She was a strong advocate for basic research at a time when a lot of the pressure was the other direction, sort of downstream. And Marcy made absolutely sure that the president's policies on science underscored the importance of basic research and agencies like the National Science Foundation. Ann Peterson was recruited as the first woman deputy director of the National Science Foundation and the first chief operating officer at that time. And she handled, I think, a number of thorny internal issues. NSF's a wonderful agency, as Mary Clutter would tell you, but from time to time there's some thorny internal issues, and the Chief Operating Officer often has to deal with those. She also worked with all of us inside the NSF to develop the first strategic plan. Cora Merritt, at that time she was Assistant Director for Social Behavioral Economic Sciences at NSF. She could always be depended on for good advice, leadership, especially when Congress attacked the social sciences, which they always do when the Republicans are in the majority. Cora, of course, has now been a long time acting director of the National Science Foundation. Mary Clutter, who I'm very pleased is here. Mary did it all. I mean, whenever you were in trouble, you needed something, you needed her to pick up and move, come upstairs, take the deputy director's job, which I think you did for some period of time. Mary was always willing to do that. It was quite extraordinary. Actually, Marion Fox was on the National Science Board. Many of you know Marianne. She was very helpful, very level-headed and helpful when the director got at opposite positions from the National Science Board, which can happen from time to time. It was always good to have somebody in that position. I think Marianne was actually vice chair at some point during that period. Franz Cordova, who at that time was the NASA chief scientist, the first woman chief scientist of NASA, she was extremely, I would say, vocal and helpful in interagency kind of activities. And she worked with Anne, and maybe Mary worked on this also on issues having to do with science misconduct. There was no federal policy on, every agency sort of did its own thing. Some agencies had no policy, I recall, on science misconduct. Carrie Ann Jones, she was that time at OSTP. She was an associate director for strategic and international affairs. She handled a lot of things, but one of them had to do with interagency cooperation on bilateral and multilateral agreements. There's always some people in the Congress that don't really like us talking with anybody outside the borders. And not only that, but you also have to deal with the State Department. You need somebody who really can help you bridge that gap, match the impedance in physics speak, and she was really good at that. She now, of course, is Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs at the State Department. Senator Barbara Mikulski. Barbara wouldn't say she's a scientist, but she was chair of NSF's Appropriations Subcommittee at that time. Now, of course, she chairs the full Senate Appropriation Committee. She's always been a strong advocate for science and for NSF and NASA in particular. She can be, tough. She can be tough, but she's done enormous good for science and research budgets over the decades. Now, in my OSTP years, moving on, this was 1998-2001, Rita now was at the National Science Foundation as my successor. She's a terrific partner on behalf of basic research and advancing the priorities of the National Science Foundation. And Rita and I flew out with President Clinton to Caltech when he gave his science speech in connection with his fiscal year 2001 budget, which he actually gave almost unprecedented increases to the science programs in many federal agencies. He also announced his nanotechnology initiative during that time. Rosina Beerbaum, at that time she was Associate Director for Environment and Natural Resources in the White House at OSTP. She handled all the science issues relating to all these environmental issues and had to deal a lot with OMB and with EPA and with AG and with the various agencies that are dealing with regulatory affairs. She was and is terrific. She was a key advisor to Vice President Gore then, and she still is to this day. She has since been dean of one of the schools, Environment and Natural Resources, I think, University of Michigan, and wrote the World Bank, the study on sustainability and many other things. She served as acting director of OSTP for a certain period, and Carrie Ann Jones, who I mentioned before, also had served in that role in an interim. Millie Dresselhaus, I already mentioned, but at that time she was director of the Department of Energy's Office of Science. I think I did the swearing in. I hope I did anyway. I'm very proud of that. And she was a very strong supporter of basic research. There has to be somebody in that role, actually in any of the agencies, who really gets it, who really believes it to the core. Shirley Ann Jackson, at that time, she was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. She's on your board, I think. And she had enormous impact. I mean, she's very strong was very strong in that role and made some really important changes. They deal with things like Yucca Mountain and so forth, and not an easy job. I also got help from folks like Arthur Prabhakar. She was then head of NIST. Martha Krebs, who was director for a period of time of the Office of Science at DOE. Sylvia Matthews. Sylvia Matthews, right now, I guess, head of OMB. At that time, she was deputy head of OMB. Sylvia was amazing because when I just see her after a staff meeting and I bring up a question and a request about a little in her context, budget item having to do with something in our portfolio, she had to keep the entire federal budget in her head, and so she said she'd look into it, and by golly, soon she would have looked into it, gotten the answer, asked me what I wanted done. Doesn't mean OMB always does what you ask them to do, but she's quite amazing. So really a good person to have in that job right now. Donna Shillelagh. She had all of HHS under her purview, but she was always very strong on science, and of course had Harold Varmus to work with. And then folks like Elena Kagan, and Janet Yellen, and science was not central to what they had to do, but when you needed help on either legal issues or economic issues, they were there to help. First Lady Hillary Clinton. Often she would fill in for us when the president was tied up and couldn't meet the teachers, the winners of the teaching awards or something like that. Hillary would be there, and she was always just an incredible hit. She would usually throw away the prepared remarks and just talk about when she was doing volunteer teaching, and Chelsea was in middle school or something, and she was teaching science, and the lesson of the day was how to grow something. So they had a pot with dirt and a lima bean, and you stick the bean in the dirt and you put water on it, and the little girls were taking notes, and so the little boys were sticking the beans up their nose. I remember that. It was just extraordinary experience. So these colleagues, and there are many others, and I apologize if I've left out people that I should not have left out, they were extraordinarily important to me, and of course it's not all about me. It means they were very important to whatever organization I was involved with, and writ large, really, to the American people for what they did. And one thing I found very interesting as I thought about this, and I hadn't in a long time, when I thought about this, it occurred to me that I never got the impression that anybody was doing this and asking themselves the question, how does this help me and how does this help my career? They were doing it because this was their job. They heard something needed to be done, even if it wasn't necessarily in their list of priorities. They just did it. That was incredible. Yeah, there were some men around, in case you're wondering. There were some men around. Jack Gibbons was extraordinary as science advisor, and Harold Varmus, I've already mentioned. Dan Golden, Ernie Moniz was Undersecretary of Energy at DOE, Jim Baker at NOAA, and John Podesta, who now is back in the White House. He's a real techie, so he was very happy, and of course Clinton and Gore. Strong. They were all very strong science. Now, I've talked about the Clinton administration. The Obama team is terrific. I mean, talk about a dream team. The team that's been in place and the team coming in as soon as the confirmations get done. We have the new team in place. So, Joe, we wish you well, and Franz Cordova, any others. So let me talk about policy in the last couple of minutes. I know, given this board, I can't tell you anything substantive that you don't already know, but I've often said in this town, not having anything substantive to say does not usually keep anybody from talking. So I'll take just a couple of minutes to say about it. My bottom line is science is in trouble. It's certainly headed for trouble in this country. You might say everything's headed for trouble, but science is really special in that it takes a long time to establish a culture that has to do with enrichment and the development of excellence in science. You can't just do that tomorrow. China's trying it. It's going to take them a while. It's not going to be easy. So science is for the long haul. And if you fall behind, it's going to take you a long time to catch up, if you ever will be able to. So I think science deserves a high priority. And, payoff doesn't happen until decades down the road. So what's the problem? Well, everything's been said about the problem. I think it's all got all kinds of dimensions. Into the Cold War, into the space race. Even the second rationale for funding research curing cancer has not been working for over a decade. That's the one that really got my attention. Federal agencies have been pressured to do less basic research. Good luck with a bold idea on some fundamental study these days. Peer review is not working very well anymore. We do not have a better option, I want to be quick to add, but what we have is not working very well right now. Budgets are not meeting demand. Competition is good, but we're way beyond good. Where we are is in a wastefulness of our capacity and the previous investments. So, small number of champions left in Congress. There are some. Joe's meeting many of them, has met many of them, and we worked with some of them. The number is smaller than it used to be, however, and so it's something to worry about. The universities are having trouble. K-12 education, we talked about earlier, still having a problem, will take a long time. Women minorities still seriously underrepresented in all fields, pretty much all fields of science, and the list is longer. So my view is unless the American people are convinced that science somehow, and I mean science broadly, but I really have my focus on the basic research, unless American people are convinced it should be a higher priority than it's been in a long time, actually, we are going to be in serious trouble. So there's no magic bullet. What can we do? Well, one thing I'm very hopeful of, and I'm encouraged by, is that so many scientists, men and women, are getting out more with the public, interacting with public officials on the Hill and back home, and writing books and appearing on television doing commercials. So even if your colleagues down the hall criticize you for doing it, do it anyway. Tell them to shove off. We have a program at the Basic Institute called the Civic Scientist Program. So this is something I've been preaching about since my NSF days. Scientists who have established themselves, but who at some point get outside the lab and the campus to interact more with the public, maybe even serve in government, as Joe's getting ready to do and Franz Cordova is going to do. Shirley Ann Jackson gave the first lecture in our series. Rita Caldwell has also lectured. Alice Wong, David Baltimore, Jane Lubchenco, and several others have been there to meet with our people and give lectures, in some cases meet with students in high schools. And we really enjoy that. I think we need more of that. It should be happening on every campus. Unless the public can put a human face on science, they're not going to listen to the rest of the message. So I'm not an expert in that area, but when I talk to social scientists who do study why people believe what they believe and how they make their differences, it's very clear that the message is not getting through when we think it's getting through. So that's something many of you do, and you do very well, and I congratulate you for it. So there's some reason to be optimist. If I have a minute, I think, what are they? Well, first, there's no lack of involvement of scientists on the policy front. We got all kinds of reports and all kinds of organizations with good ideas. It's just that it's hard to get them actually injected into policy, but we got lots of people with good ideas. We have a new project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, following on the ARISE 1 and ARISE 2 studies, which some of your board members participated in. The new one is one which we're calling new tools, if you like, new models, I guess, and I'm co-chairing with Norm Augustine on that, and several members of your board are working with us on that. Our focus is really on long-term. How can we establish a strategic long-term mechanism, if you like, to keep a focus on these important issues, including underrepresentation of women and minorities? And we've got all kinds of ideas, but we're not out of the woods yet. We don't have a report. Anyway, I'm optimistic that lots of people are trying. A second reason, there are more women in science, in scientific research, in leadership positions, in policy. And it's my experience that when women take these jobs, they tend to do those jobs very well, and that's why I gave you the examples. Those are only my examples. Maybe there are other examples I don't know about, but that's what I think. Third reason for optimism is young people. Now, I meet a select group of young people like many of you do. They're the leaders of tomorrow. But I find they have tremendous advantages over my generation. They know a lot. They're smart in at least many dimensions. And they have access to technology that, of course, didn't exist and we didn't have. They're very comfortable working in communities and groups and with people born in other countries and in other belief systems, other sense of values. Our at least my experience was very homogeneous in those early years. They have a better sense about where the U.S. is and needs to be in the world, I think, than we probably did at my time. And I have an impression that gender is less an issue among these young people, but I don't have any data on that, and I know we've already had comments on that at the meeting. I'd be very interested to see if there's if there is research on this issue. Fourth reason, bit of a stretch, Congress does have periods of relative sanity. And so I'm hopeful that one will come along. But in the meantime, what we really need to be doing is to survive, take the opportunity to make sure our house is in order, and then see if we can figure out how to set science as a higher priority in federal policy making than it has been, as I've already said, in many years. Or it might just be what Churchill said about us. You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other possibilities. Thank you so much for what you do, and thank you for having me.